How are you all? Are you all okay? It's nice to see your familiar faces. Great.
Yeah, they're all on mute.
You don't have to be. We can have a conversation. Hi, Herman. It's nice to see you. I'm glad you opened up. Where's Mike? Is Mike there? There's Mike. Where's Seamus? Okay, I'm having a conversation with you because I gave a talk on a book panel at the main library in February, and Jerry came to it, and I think Mike I told Mike about it, a guy that we loved very much as a kid. Joaquin is not my new boyfriend. Joaquin is our mentor from the International Hotel. Are you all familiar with the International Hotel? Okay, great. Because he, what happened is he mentored us when we were students at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley during, the pivotal 60s. And he had this long, Joaquin Legaspi had this long history of movement history. And when he passed in 1976, Jovina Navarro, who was also mentored by him, put out this book. This is the original book. And this is one of Mr. Legaspi's paintings. And it's called Flight, but it can also be called Descent. And then it could be called Attack. So this was printed in 76 when he passed away. And we realized a lot of our younger folks don't know who he is. And so we reprinted, so February 19th at the library is a collection of his poetry and some of the poetry of some of the people he mentored. And so I was excited that Jerry was interested to know about that. So he asked me to talk a little bit about, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. So I wasn't quite sure how to do this. So basically, in the chat, I put in my books, and I think they're all in this, in the main library. I think they carry my books. So anyway.
Juanita, we're not seeing it in the chat. Did you?
Yeah, I just put it in.
Okay.
To everyone. Oh, I got to say to everyone, don't I? I have to click. Sorry about that. Thank you, Martha. Let me see. All right.
Oh, great.
Ready to go?
Great.
Okay.
And I'm going to enter the link for the video of you that's on YouTube.
Oh my God.
So that's something people can check out, and they can save the chat and look at it later.
Which one is that?
That's the when you were presented the award for San Francisco State University.
Oh. I put that on our website. If you go to the website, narfe65.org, go to the side panel where it says member profiles.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
You'll see Juanita's name. When you click on Juanita's name, it brings up the YouTube video.
Oh, thank you, Martha.
And it's very interesting, actually. It's a very interesting video. I liked it.
Thank you. Also, because it's really not just about me, it's about that period in history.
Yeah.
So great. And any event. So what I wanted to talk a little about briefly, Jerry asked me to talk about Filipinos in San Francisco. And so, Filipinos first came to the North American continent back in 1565. I don't know if a lot of people know that, because of the Manila galleon trade, which went from 1565 to 1850. And what happened is, Spain and the other European empires were very interested in the riches and spices and resources of Asia. And the Philippines, given the archipelago, becomes the stepping stone to go to Asia. And so, for several centuries, the Manila galleon went back and forth between Manila and Acapulco. Acapulco, they took out the gold and silver, sent it to Asia. And in return, and some of you know this history better than I, the spices, the ceramics, the textiles from Asia. There was a big, exchange. And so what happened, the Manila galleon ships were staffed primarily by Filipinos and Chinese men. And when they got to Acapulco, well, a lot of them jumped ship and they went up and down the Texas coast, Gulf of Mexico coast. And in fact, one of the first colonies of Filipinos is in New Orleans, in Louisiana, the Bayou men. And what happened is there were Filipino dads. They were all, a lot of them were like single young guys, you know. That's who go on the ship and go for adventure. And they made their way up into New Orleans. And in the meantime, there's a famine going on in Ireland. And so a lot of the young Irish women come to the Atlantic, go across the Atlantic up to the Northeast. And there are all these single women. And the Catholic Church in its wisdom sees all these Irish women is single and all these Filipinos, single males. And they get the women to go down to New Orleans. And so that's 10 generations of Filipino-Irish families. So they go, so my point is they go a ways back. There's also a book, I did not write it. A lot of my colleagues wrote it. It's my book is this one called Filipinos in Washington, D.C. And that's 100 years. It goes from 1903 to about 2010. But the earlier one was called, and this is in the library, Filipinos in San Francisco, if you really want to know this. The nice thing about this book and my book is that it's pictorial. there's a little narrative, you know, but they talk about, I'm trying to find something really cool. Like here's a family in Golden Gate Park. You know, that was always an icon is growing up with that. And then, you know, they're very much into things like church. So there's always these big pictures of the church and weddings and stuff like that. Now I want to get back a little bit to Manong Joaquin. Manong means big brother in my first language, Ilocano. The Ilocos is the northern part of the Philippines. There are 3 main island groups. The Ilocos is basically the Luzon, you know, where Manila is based, and then the Visayan Islands, which is chains of islands, and then Mindanao, which is in the south, which is Muslim country. So anyway, Manong means big brother. And when the guys, and you all know that the United States was colonized the Philippines, right? The Filipinos thought the Americans were coming in to help them fight against the Spaniards. And then the US turns around and says, oh no, we're going to capture you. The whole empire colonization of the US. So Manong Legaspi was born in the Philippines in August 17th, 1896, and he passed in September 1975. And that's important to me because my father, Lazaro Tamayo, he was born also in the 19th century, December 15th, 1898, and he passed in 1978. And the reason that to me they're important is because my father and Mr. Legaspi, and we called him Mr. Legaspi because he wasn't really our big brother. I mean, he was more like our grandfather, uncle kind of figure. But they were important because you know what? They were taught by the guys in the Philippines who led the revolution against Spain. And so when they migrate to the United States, well, first off, they were, Joaquin and Lazaro learned about who their president was because they were born under, you know, when the US took over, George Washington was their president, right? And the public education system and the public health system were American. And so they pledged allegiance to the flag. And, you know, my mom and dad, I mean, they went through an American educational system because that's what it was. The Tomasites brought that. So they thought they were American, but they also had this revolutionary background from Spain. And so I say that because this generation were the guys who were involved in organizing the international movement. It wasn't just, the local unions, but the international movement. So that's the background. And so today, coming to today, we're trying to get the younger generation to be involved, like civically involved, or understand what's going on. But we're finding that they have different media. What they're doing is going into, like we did poetry, we did dance. We learned that from Mr. Legaspi, who was an artist, who was a poet. And the arts are very important in Filipino culture. People dance, people sing, they play different instruments, they perform. The performing arts are very key. And that's what we're getting from the younger generation. Bruno Mars and a couple of folks, just I should know their names. They won the Grammys. They're into like the entertainment world. That's the big deal that they're into. The best R&B performance. And then there's a movie called The Fabulous Filipino Brothers. I don't know if it's a comedy. It's about these four brothers out of Pittsburgh, California, and how they relate to their parents and their grandparents and their kids and the relationships with folks. So that's pretty funny. And so that's where the younger generation is right now. And my work right now, because now I'm in Seattle, is trying to talk to the younger folks about, that they can make a difference. They can make a difference, because that's what I do in my book, Golden Children. And I know some of you have read it, that the fact of the matter is things were pretty hard, as we know, post World War II. We still had the Korean War going on afterwards. We had the anti-war movement, we had the civil rights movement, and we thought things were pretty bad there was the McCarthy era. And so the idea is, how do you get the younger people to do stuff? And Manong Legaspi really was a very interesting man, in the sense that he was there at the International Hotel. He didn't live there. He lived in one of the other hotels. And in the 1970s, there were still a lot of SROs in that area of Chinatown, Manila town, past the Transamerica building. And the old guys had been involved in the labor movement, in the 30s. And then they also fought in World War II. And they also were in the Hukbalahap movement, which was the guerrilla movement in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And so these guys came with a lot of background, and because they were brought up in the American system, they knew government. Filipinos do really well, actually, in the bureaucracy. They're special assistants to, they're the person you go to, the high level staff, because they know all the intricacies. That's what I've discovered, because they understand the system, and a lot of them serve in the military. So what happens is these guys, young guys in their 20s, I think Mr. Legaspi came when he was a teenager, and my dad came when he was 20. So they go to Hawaii, right? Because that's where there's slavery has now been abolished. And so what happens is that, where do you get the new labor to do the West Coast, right? Because now the United States has grown. So everything is burgeoning west of the Mississippi. And so you get the folks from where? The Rio Grande, Well, the Mexicans were here first, actually. And so, so you get that labor pool, you get the indigenous folks, they were here. They were not happy to be farmers. And so the Chinese get recruited, the Japanese get recruited, the Puerto Ricans get recruited, the Portuguese get recruited to Hawaii first. And then from Hawaii to the West Coast, you're doing Imperial Valley, you're doing San Joaquin Valley, up and down to California, and Oregon, and into Washington, and then into Alaska, with the canneries and the fisheries. Those guys were all labor union. They come out of the farm movement. The farm movement in California did not start with Cesar Chavez. It started with the Filipinos, with people like Larry Itliong, And that kind of history is still coming out. And so what I'm trying to convey to you is these guys like Legaspi did all this organizing work, both in Hawaii and on the coast, for farmers, for workers' rights, for housing rights, and then later on to make sure that they were able to get things like their Social Security benefits or SSI or whatever they needed as they got older in the International Hotel. And so in terms of the international workers movement and union organizing and public service, so a lot of the labor strikes in the early part of the 20th century were organized by Filipinos and Japanese in Hawaii organizing together. And then on the West Coast, in terms of the Mexicans and Filipinos in the farmlands. And then in Alaska with the Alaska natives and the Filipinos organizing. And a lot of this is documented in a classic book called America is in the Heart by Carlos Bulosan. Hey, Dee, you know that, huh? Yeah, so that's how people learned about the Filipinos in the US. But again, it was a very male focus. And of course, it was very male focused for a long time because Filipino women didn't immigrate to the United States with the men, just like the Chinese, the first generations. They came alone because the idea was they were going to make enough money and go back. The Japanese were different. The Japanese, because of the relationship of the United States to Japan, which was at a higher level, the Japanese government was able to lobby that, you can't have the guys alone, you have to bring the whole family. So Japanese roots have been established in the US as a family, as opposed to the Chinese and Filipinos who were initially the first generation, was just single men. And that most of the evolution of family units occurs after World War II, when they can bring women and children to the United States. So my point here is that the Filipinos were very involved in, labor organizing, but also military service. A lot of Filipinos serve multi-generations, the grandfather, the parent, and the grandchildren. You'll find them all in the different services. Also Pacific Islanders, they're very much into the military. But then that makes sense, right? Because there are bases, American bases in the Philippines and all over the Pacific. But also that gets them into the middle class. When you can get like a government job, whether it be military or civilian, that gets you into the system and you learn how to play the system. And also because they're very patriotic, they want to serve their country. And that works out for them. So, and then the other kinds of jobs they were getting in the civilian world was post office, because you had to take a test. And as long as you scored really high, and a lot of these guys scored high, they got in. I mean, that was the interesting thing, is the post office was looked at as a really good middle class job. You weren't out in the fields and you weren't being a janitor or a busboy. You were out, it was an inside job, and you were serving people. So that civil service came about. And then, of course, you've heard of people like General Taguba, Major General Taguba, who wrote the Abu Ghraib report. He's been a hero for a lot of us, a more contemporary hero than Mr. Legaspi. But I mentioned Joaquin Legaspi because he was in the background. He was this old guy, and he loved the young Turks, the young people, the radicals from UC, the radicals from State, UCLA. But he would be there to talk to us individually, and just say, hey, what about this point of view? But I guess what I wanted you to know about these guys were strong, they were passionate, but they were very quiet. They had this dignity to them. I don't know, was that generation, but the people in the 20s and 30s. And you've probably seen pictures of Filipino guys who are always pretty well dressed. But of course, that was the regular culture too, right? People dressed up. I'm trying to see. I mean, here's a picture of, where was this? At the Philippine Pavilion at the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island in 1939, for example. You know, people are dressed up like any San Franciscan. but that's what they showed us with that. You gotta carry yourself, you know, make a good presentation, look positive and think positive, even though life is really hard. And that's what they gave to us. And I think now you have people like Zenei Triunfo-Cortez, who is a nurse, and she is the president of the California Nurses Association, and also the National Nurses Organizing Committee, because, you know, particularly with COVID, the nurses have been really organizing. You know, there are a lot of Filipinos who are nurses who are in the health field who are organizing. And then the other thing we learned from Mr. Legaspi, you know, because we were like 19 or 20 years old, is he said, you have to go down to City Hall and tell them about what the problem is and what you need. But you have to go into the meetings, you have to sit there, and when it's time to testify, you better be ready to testify. And that means you have to have your thoughts in order. You have to think about what you're going to say, who you're going to say it to. And then you have to be polite, you know, and then if you don't get what you want the first time, then try again. But do it with class. He didn't want us to go mowing, though some people did, right? But it was always this, you know, there was this sense of grace and perseverance and artwork. And he said, you know, run for office, make sure you vote. And that self-determination and relevant education, you know, we were saying like, yeah, we're going to serve the people, but how do you serve the people? Well, vote, vote, sign people up for the benefits that they work for all their lives. I mean, that was a learning experience for us working at the International Hotel to help the Manongs like him. There were lots of older single men who had no families because they'd left the Philippines when they were young guys. And, you know, for them to take them to their medical appointments, to help them file their Social Security claims, you know, or their SSI if necessary, or just to navigate the system. I think that taught a lot of us, you know, that if we're going to change the world, you're going to have to start at that very basic level of serving the people that are most vulnerable, and doing it with grace and dignity. And so when we met together at the, we were in the African American Center, actually, up in the third floor of the library, of the main library. The feeling was that, you know, at this moment in American history, it's important for us again to think about what we've been through and take the resources and lessons and the role models from whom we learned in earlier struggles and earlier successes, and bring that to fruition to the younger generation. And so it was really moving for us that this gentleman, he had no children himself. He was married, but, you know, and a lot of his artwork wasn't inventoried or documented, and he would give things away. Like he'd give his poems away, he'd give his artwork away, he'd give his photography work away. He worked with Benny Buffano, and he was also in New York and down at the Greenwich Village with the 1930s and 1940s. So now the next step that we want to do as a community at the library was for the younger generation to go around and talk to individuals in the community to see if they have the poetry and some of the artwork of Mr. Legaspi, so that we can build on it and put that together. And also to make sure that we document, you know, that not just remember people like at a memorial service, but that we continue to talk, we continue to write, and, carry on.